A girl from a small town went out for a walk and disappeared without a trace. Her parents immediately panicked and called the police, but what happened next sparked outrage in their tight-knit community. This mystery remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades, and only recently did detectives uncover the truth in quite an unexpected way. Danielle Houchins was born on November 11, 1980, in Alexandria, Minnesota. Shortly after, her parents had 2 more kids, a boy and a girl. Once their youngest was born, the family decided to move to a small town called Belgrade, Montana. The quiet place was surrounded by mountains and located far from big cities, but it was a popular destination for tourists. A lot of people came there to ski or hike in the mountains, enjoying the picturesque nature. Danielle's parents chose the town mostly because they were offered jobs on the ski patrol. This was perfect for both of them since they loved spending as much time outdoors as possible. Their passion spread to their kids from a very young age, and the family was always up for an adventure. They went skiing, hiking, fishing, and took boat trips on the nearby rivers. Danielle herself got really into climbing, which was easy to get into around there. At the same time, Danielle managed to excel at school. She quickly became one of the top students and had big plans for her future. She dreamed of going to medical school and becoming a bioengineer. On September 21, 1996, their town was hosting its annual festival. People would gather on the streets, listen to music, watch some performances, and just enjoy the day together. Danielle, who was 15 at the time, had plans to meet up with her friends in the evening, but before that, she had a few free hours to kill. Instead of just sitting at home, she decided to go for a walk along the trail located near the river just outside of town. Her mom asked her to be back by 2 p.m. and gave Danielle her wristwatch since she didn't have one of her own. Danielle grabbed a bottle of water and headed out around 11:30, promising to be back on time. But 2 o'clock came and went, and she still hadn't returned. Her mom started to worry, especially since they were expecting guests soon. Thinking Danielle must have just lost track of time, she decided to head to the trail to bring her home. She took a friend with her, and they drove to the parking lot where the trail started. The first thing they noticed was Danielle's white pickup truck. Even though she was only 15 and technically not allowed to drive without an adult, her parents would sometimes let her use the car. It was a small, quiet town with little traffic, and Danielle was already a pretty good driver. Her mom noticed the truck's doors were unlocked, but Danielle was nowhere to be seen. She and her friends started walking along the trail toward the river, but they didn't get far before they spotted Danielle's car keys and her bottle lying on the ground. Her mom became even more worried and started calling out for her, searching the path from the parking lot to the river. When there was still no sign of Danielle, she wasted no time and went straight to the authorities for help. At that point, her mom thought Danielle might have fallen off a slope or gotten injured in some accident. Since the woman didn't have a cell phone, she drove to the police station, and about an hour later, search teams arrived at the trail. The searchers combed through the trail and the surrounding woods, checking the riverbank as well, but they couldn't find any trace of Danielle. As night fell and temperatures dropped close to freezing, the rescuers decided to call off the search until morning. However, Danielle's family refused to go home. They continued searching for her, joined by family, friends, and local residents who broke into groups and spread out to cover more ground. In one of those search groups was a man and his 2 sons, who were friends with Danielle's sister. They headed into the wooded area near the riverbank, using flashlights to guide their way. A few hundred yards from the parking lot, they noticed something strange in the water and went closer to check it out. Shining their lights into the river, they realized it was Danielle's body, lying near the shore in just a few feet of water. The man immediately knew she was dead and ran back to his car to notify the police. On his way to the station, however, he spotted Danielle's father and broke the devastating news to him. The police examined the scene and handed Danielle's body over to medical experts, who needed a few days to conduct a proper examination and determine the cause of death. But despite this, the sheriff quickly announced that it appeared to be an accident. There were no visible wounds or signs of foul play, so the police initially believed Danielle may have just accidentally fallen into the river and drowned. Danielle's family, devastated by the news of her death, couldn't believe it. From a young age, she had spent a lot of time outdoors, was very familiar with nature and knew that trail along the river well. Her parents also couldn't understand how she could have drowned in such shallow water. Still, the sheriff stuck to his version and didn't launch a proper investigation. But everything changed when the medical examiners released their report. They discovered that Danielle had numerous scratches and bruises, which looked like defensive wounds. It appeared she had fought back against someone. They also noted that her underwear had been pulled down. The experts found it hard to imagine how this could have happened in the course of an accident. Moreover, they established that Danielle had been sexually assaulted and found a biological sample from an unknown male on her underwear. As for the cause of death, the examiners agreed that she had been drowned, but it seemed that someone had held her underwater. They also noticed that Danielle's watch, which should have been on her wrist, was found up near her elbow. The experts suggested that the killer might have dragged her by the arms, causing the watch to slip down as he pulled her toward the river. Despite all these findings, the medical examiners for some reason still listed the manner of death as undetermined. While they were sure Danielle had drowned, they couldn't find enough solid evidence to conclusively prove it was an intentional murder. Because of this, the police didn't launch a full investigation, maintaining that they were still uncertain about what really happened to Danielle. Even so, they did try to gather more details. When forensic experts examined Danielle's clothes, they found 4 hairs on her underwear, which also belonged to an unknown male. They believe these were arm hairs and managed to extract a partial DNA sample. However, the FBI didn't yet have a national DNA database. The only thing the experts could confirm was that the hairs and the semen found on Danielle's underwear came from the same person. The police also re-examined the area where Danielle's body was found and discovered a man's boot print in the dirt, although they weren't able to determine if it was connected to the case. Investigators questioned several potential suspects they thought might be involved, but couldn't link any of them to the crime. The problem was that the DNA sample they had was only partial, so they couldn't even compare it to the suspect's DNA. It's worth mentioning that many details of this case were kept secret, not only from the public, but also from Danielle's own family. For a long time, they didn't even know that she had been sexually assaulted. From their perspective, it seemed like the police genuinely didn't have any idea what happened to Danielle and were still trying to figure it out. Despite the sheriff's position, some police officers were puzzled that the case hadn't been reclassified as a homicide and investigated accordingly. One of them was Cindy Botek, who had joined the police just a few days before Danielle's death. She's been involved in the investigation and, from the very beginning, was convinced they were dealing with a murder. However, back then she didn't have the authority to go against her superiors and launch a full-scale investigation, so all she could do was wonder what had really happened that day. One of the theories was that the killer might have known Danielle, like a neighbor or a friend. Botek spoke with her parents, but they couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm their daughter. She had never had any problems with her classmates or anyone else in town. For months after Danielle's death, there was almost no progress in the case. The police continued to interview people and consider various suspects, but because of the sheriff's reluctance to start a proper investigation, they couldn't do much. Some officers, including Botek, were baffled that the case hadn't been reclassified as a homicide and that no one was actively searching for the killer. To them, it was obvious that Danielle had been attacked, and the person responsible could still be living in their community. A few years after the murder, the police tried entering the partial DNA sample found on Danielle's body into the FBI database, but no matches were found. In the years following Danielle's death, her family learned more details about the case, including the fact that she had been sexually assaulted. They were outraged that the sheriff hadn't treated it as a homicide from the start and had kept such critical information from them. The sheriff later claimed he had never considered the case an accident and had always believed it was a murder. This contradicted his earlier statements to local newspapers, where he had clearly said there wasn't enough evidence to label it a homicide. Danielle's parents also remembered him telling them the same thing, which only fueled their frustration and confusion. The sheriff then tried to shift the focus onto the medical examiners, insisting that the only reason he didn't launch a full investigation was because they had listed the manner of death as undetermined. But Danielle's family believed the sheriff was just trying to avoid responsibility. Everyone understood that a proper investigation in the first few days after the murder could have helped solve the case and catch the killer, but little effort was made. Now, many years later, finding the murderer had become far more difficult, with the trail gone cold. Danielle's parents continued to fight for a fair investigation, but each attempt led to a dead end. Eventually, her younger sister took up the case, giving interviews to local media, reaching out to investigators, and doing everything in her power to ensure that one day Danielle's killer would be found. In 2019, 23 years after the murder, Danielle's family finally managed to get the investigation reopened. Unfortunately, this didn't lead to any real breakthroughs. The FBI's DNA database still didn't show any matches, and re-examining old suspects went nowhere, leaving the case stalled once again. This continued until 2021, when a new sheriff took over the local police department. He had joined the force just days before Danielle's death, and her case had haunted him ever since. Like some of his colleagues, he had always believed it was a murder, and now he had the authority to launch a full investigation. But after so many years, he had almost no solid leads, except for the partial DNA sample from the possible perpetrator. The sheriff realized the case needed a fresh perspective, so he brought in two outside experts. One was a former investigator from California who now worked as a private detective, and the other was a DNA specialist. Together, they focused on identifying the owner of the hair and the biological material found on Danielle's underwear. First, they sent the samples to a lab in California, which had some of the most advanced DNA analysis tools, and then they waited. Around the same time, in August 2023, Danielle's case was officially reclassified as a homicide, nearly 27 years after her death. A few months later, in early 2024, experts from the lab contacted the investigators, saying they hadn't gotten closer to identifying the owner of the DNA. Although they had managed to do something important, their tools allowed them to extract a full DNA profile, which was still a significant step forward. The investigators then sent these samples to another lab in Virginia, hoping they could use genetic genealogy to trace the DNA back to its owner. Several months passed before they finally got the call they were waiting for. The experts at the Virginia lab explained that they had uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to public genetic databases, where people voluntarily share their DNA to find relatives. These databases have helped solve many cases using genetic genealogy, tracing suspects through their family trees. But this time, things took an unexpected turn. To the experts' surprise, they immediately got a perfect match. It turned out that the owner of the DNA had willingly submitted his sample to the database, something that doesn't happen often. The man was 55-year-old Paul Hutchinson, who lived in a small town called Dillon, about 100 miles from where Danielle was killed. Investigators discovered that at the time of the murder, Hutchinson was 27 and a student at the University of Montana, just 12 miles from Belgrade. He had a degree in biology and worked for Montana's Bureau of Land Management. Paul was also married with 2 children. What stood out even more was that he had no criminal record, not even the slightest offense. Now that the police had identified their suspect, they needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from him. On July 23rd, they went to his workplace to talk to him. As they pulled up to the Bureau building, they saw Paul standing outside with his coworkers. The investigators told him they wanted to ask him a few questions at the station, and according to them, they could see the color drain from his face. Still, Paul agreed to go in for questioning. The detectives took their time, starting by asking about other unsolved cases in the area. Paul remained fairly calm at first, but everything changed when they showed him a photo of Danielle. He suddenly became extremely nervous, sweating, scratching his face, and even chewing on his hands. He could barely stand up and even stumbled over a chair when trying to get up. To the police, his reaction was almost a confirmation of guilt. However, Paul continued to deny any involvement in the murder, but his confession wasn't necessary. Detectives collected his DNA sample and sent it to the lab. For now, they let him go, since they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with the murder until the lab results came back. Right after the interrogation, the detectives contacted Danielle's sister and told her that they had finally found her sister's killer. They added that the police had no doubt about his guilt and that the DNA analysis would only confirm it. Danielle's sister, who had been waiting nearly 28 years for this moment, felt relieved knowing the person responsible would finally face justice. She was also aware that they still had to go through a long court process to bring this case to a close. But things took an unexpected turn. The day after the interrogation, when the police were supposed to receive the DNA results from the lab, Paul called his local police station, saying he needed help. He gave the operator his location and then hung up. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Paul's car parked on the side of the road. Inside, they found him, dead, with a gun lying beside him. During the investigation, detectives concluded that Paul did it himself. There was no note in the car, but his motive seemed clear. He likely realized there was no way to avoid prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. For his wife and children, the entire situation was a complete shock. None of them knew what Paul had done nearly 30 years ago, and they weren't even aware that he had been questioned by the police. His family learned about these accusations at the same time they found out about his death. Paul's friends and coworkers were just as stunned when the truth came out. They all saw him as a devoted family man and a reliable friend. Despite the shock to those who knew him, detectives had no doubt that Paul was responsible for Danielle's murder. In August 2024, they held a press conference where they announced that his DNA was a perfect match with the samples found on the victim's underwear. Police believed this was a crime of opportunity. There was no evidence that Danielle knew Paul. It's likely she crossed paths with him near the trail, and he made the decision to assault her, killing her afterward to ensure she wouldn't identify him. Danielle's family admitted that hearing about Paul's death brought them more relief than frustration, even though he would not face a lifetime in prison. What angered them most was the thought that he could have been caught decades earlier if the local sheriff had taken the case more seriously. If that had happened, Paul wouldn't have been able to live nearly 30 years of freedom, start a family, and enjoy a peaceful life. Paul's wife also expressed her condolences to Danielle's family, stating that she in no way supported or excused what he had done. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.